right, welcome back to Business 210, Principles of Management with Professor Joe Lane online. Wow, still kind of feels strange to say that. Oh, by the way, hope you did notice here a change in attire. I figure when I come to class, I don't come to class in the same thing every time, so maybe I should change up my attire a little bit for you as well. And plus, this thing is probably going to go viral. I'm going to probably get some awards for this and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, I want to look sharp. Okay, enough of that silliness. Chapter 15, Interpersonal and Organizational Communications. This is the communication chapter. Okay. What I would do if you were here with me is I would ask you, are you a good communicator? And some of you would say, probably the majority of you would say yes. Most of you are in school, you have to work on your communications. Some of you would say, when I have to be. Some of you would say, it depends. But would we all agree that communications is really, really important? You know, we in our home life, our personal life, anything else we do, and certainly in the world of business, communications is maybe the most important thing of all in some ways. In that, I say that by saying this: when managers plan, organize, lead, and control, what do? They have to communicate in all four of those. So communications is really, really important. Then I'd probably ask you, well, how do you make your communications effective? I mean, if you are a good communicator, what are some tricks that you might use? And I don't know, you might tell me some things like I make sure I keep eye contact with that person. You might tell me something like I ask questions or something like that when I try to communicate. I try to see the other person's point of view. You could probably tell me a number of things that might be helpful to help you communicate. Okay, I'm looking at my beautifully prepared, somewhat, Chapter 15 handout. The problems with communication are a fact of human existence. We're never going to be perfect at it, but we want to get better and better and better. 14% of each 40 hours are wasted where better communications could have saved money. You know, if truly 14% of each 40-hour week is wasted because of poor communications, we definitely want to do better. All right. Interpersonal and organizational communications. I think I would know, as we start off chapter 15, I think I'd know the definition of communications. The transfer of information and understanding from one person to another. Look at this statistic here. 84% of a manager's time is involved with communications. Who do managers manage? Managers manage people. Managers are interacting with their people all the time. They're interacting with their boss. They're interacting with their peers most of the time through communication. Okay, if you have taken speech, you've probably taken some other courses, you have seen this communication model. Now, I think that in your study guide for these chapters that you have in Canvas, I printed for you a couple of pages out of the book that really showed this communication process and kind of explained everything about it. So I want to take a couple of minutes. This is going to be a no, by the way. Are you going to have to somehow explain the communication process to me on the final? No, you are. On test number 4, the final. I used to get all hung up with who is the more important, the sender or the receiver? And now I don't do that anymore. They're both vitally important in communications. Okay? The sender, when they start to send a communication, who should be number one in their mind? The receiver. They know what they want to say. They know the results they want. This is a person that doesn't. So you need to have, if you're the sender, have this person in mind. When you decode it, when you put the message in form, when you start bringing it together and coming up with a message, you need to do that with this person in mind. After you've put it together, you have formulated, not a mess, that's an abbreviation for message, okay? You've come up after you've encoded this into a message. Then you have to determine the medium. How are you going to deliver it? Are you going to text it, person to person, company bulletin board, email? You know what I'm saying. And then again, this is all wrapped around the message. The receiver is then going to decode it. They're going to break that message down as it goes into their head. And this is a good reason why, if you're a sender and you're a manager and you're sending something to your employee or even to your boss or whomever, you need to know that person. You need to know that person's, how does that person think? How does that person break stuff down? Because that's going to help you with how you encode it, having an idea of how that person's going to decode it. Then the receiver gets it and then feedback to the sender. Hopefully the feedback is what you want. It was a transfer of information and understanding, so the results of that communication was what you wanted that communication to be. Now, throughout the communication process, there is noise. Noise can happen in the medium. It can happen anywhere through the communication process. So I would say that I want you to know the definition of communications, and I want you to know the communication process. Okay, if you're looking at my handout, he talks about media richness. The richness of the media that you use to convey your message. He says this, media richness, how well a particular medium conveys information and promotes learning. All right. Now, what comes next, I don't want to confuse you. There is rich media and there's lean media. So immediately we want to say, well, rich is good and lean is bad. That's not true. Media richness talks about how well a particular medium conveys information and promotes learning. Sometimes it takes rich medium to convey learning and information. Sometimes it takes lean medium. Okay? So, for example, if you were going to terminate somebody, you were going to call, if you had to, the message you had to convey was, you're gone. Would the medium you choose be very important? How would you handle that? I bet as I'm sitting here, I can just hear you saying, I would call them into my office. I'd go over it with them then. What you'd be saying is, you'd be doing, would you post it on the company bulletin board? Fred is fired. No. That's not the way you would do that. You would need a very rich medium, a back and forth, a face-to-face, so because you got to make sure everything is understood in this. Okay, let's say that a worker's work schedule. What is going to be your, and you probably have some of you that are listening to this or watching this, your schedule at work. How is your work schedule always done? Well, it's posted on the board. That's the way the work schedules are always done. And if that's the way they're always done, that would be lean medium. Just post it on the board. As long as it's accurate and that's where people know to go to find it, that's fine. So I would like for you to be familiar with what media richness is. And I'd like for you to be familiar, what it is, and rich media. Rich is for face-to-face important type stuff. Non-routine type stuff. Lean media works best for routine type matters. I'd like you to be familiar with rich and lean and what media richness is. Okay, if you've got your handout in front of you, if you have printed it off, I'm going to jump to the back of the page for a minute, then I'm going to come back to the front because I'm going to kind of follow the book a little bit more than I follow my notes. Every organizational structure excuse my back, maybe my best side, hope my hair is combed. Okay, organizational structure. You have in a company, you have a formal organizational structure and you have an informal organizational structure. We've talked about that before. the CEO, the vice presidents, the chain of command that goes down from here to here to here and on down through the organization. That's the formal organizational structure. Then you also have those informal relationships and everything that happen within an organization. Right. Formal and informal organizational structures. We talked about that in some of the other chapters. Okay, along with that, if you have formal and informal communication, informal and informal organizational structures, you're also going to have formal and informal communications. So on the back side of your handout, the way I have mine, formal communication channels follow the chain of command and are recognized as official. This is official stuff. You've been getting probably as a student through your email, through Canvas, official notifications from the college about certain things, about maybe when registration starts next week or some things like that. That's the formal communication channel. The formal channel goes down, it comes up, and it goes horizontal as well. As downward, upward, vertical between, for coordination between departments and that sort of thing. Very important, Now, the informal communication channels. If you have an informal organizational structure, you're going to have informal communication channels. There's two things that our author mentions about this. Well, first of all, what is it? Which I want you to be familiar with as well. Develop outside the formal structure and do not follow the chain of command. This is informal stuff. It doesn't follow the chain of command. One thing he mentions is the grapevine. There used to be that song, Tell It on the Grapevine. I'd love to sing that to you now. But I don't know the words. I don't know how to sing. There's a lot of problems with that. So just if you ever have heard that heard it on the grapevine, just sing that to yourself right now. Can you stamp out the informal organizational structure? The answer is no. Can you stamp out informal organizational communication? The answer is no. The grapevine is going to have some accurate information on it. It's going to have some inaccurate information on it. But the grapevine is just going to be there. Now, can the grapevine sometimes be troublesome to a company? The answer to that is yes. If the wrong thing gets out there on the grapevine, if things start getting stirred up, if you start having things like that, and it's just not informal talk, just informal around the water cooler talk or at lunchtime talk, but it gets to be something that can be maybe somewhat detrimental to the company, that's harmful. How can a company help keep the grapevine from being detrimental? Let me give you the best way. Your formal communications, do a good job of your formal communications. Let your employees know what they need to know. Let them know it when they need to know it. Keep your employees informed. If you will get the information out to your employees, they don't have to guess about it. If something happens and nobody says anything about it, employees are going to start trying to figure out what it is. Then they're going to start making up things that they think, and before you know it's going to get all over the place. It may not be accurate at all, but if you've gone ahead and put something out, keep your employees informed. You're not going to eliminate the grapevine because you're going to have that informal talk, but it'll keep it from being detrimental. Now, this other thing I've got to spend a couple of minutes on. Sorry. Management by wandering around. It's a great management idea. I would encourage every one of you, if you become a manager, practice management by wandering around. It's a great way to communicate informally, but be very, very helpful. Whenever I've worked anywhere, but when I worked for the Monroe City School System, where my office was, I had the door that led out to, the other part of the business office and, all that sort of stuff. But I had a kind of an escape hatch that went out through the the custodial department and the garage and out where the buses are and all that sort of stuff. So I could get out of my office several ways. And I always would get out of my office and simply wander around. I'd talk to the folks, that I work with, like Professor Smalling, who, taught accounting here. I would talk to the different people, that were in the office directly, associated with me. I'd talk to other folks. I'd go out sometimes, talk to the garage folks. I'd go out and talk to the bus operators some. I didn't do this every day, but I got out and chatted with people. And you know what? I wasn't out there to try to listen or hear or catch something. I just wanted to talk. But a lot of times people won't come and talk to you in your office. That's too formal. But if you're in an informal setting like that, they'll chat with you. And a lot of times they'll tell you things you need to know and the things that you need to deal with. And other times they just may be telling you things personal. Hey, my son John, he's been going through a really tough illness. He's got pneumonia, and it's really been a fight on John. He's getting better now. And then about a week or so later, you see that employee and you say, "Hey, how's John doing?" Now, hopefully you really care. Does that impress that employee? Hey, Joe Lane, he asked me about my son. He remembered us talking about my son. Management by wandering around. You can pick up a lot of good things. It's a good way to just interact informally with folks. I have to give you one example, and then we're going to move on to some more stuff. When I was at ULM, wasn't ULM back then, Dwight Vines, Dr. Dwight Vines was president of the university. He just recently passed away, I think in his late 80s. Dr. Vines was the president. Dr. Vines also was a tremendous tennis player. He played in college and he continued to play, and Dr. Vines was small and fit, and he could play tennis with most anybody. Dr. Vines would come out in his president's office. He had a bathroom, all this kind of stuff. Several times a week, President Vines would change into his tennis attire, his shorts, his shirt, the stuff, and he'd have his bag with his tennis rackets and everything, and he would walk from his office across the campus, where ULM, across the campus to the tennis courts to play tennis. A lot of times he'd play with the tennis players over there that were on the tennis team because he was that good. So he walks over there, and then when he came back, he would normally walk back a different way. You know how many people Dr. Vines saw, President Vines saw as he was doing that? Do you think he got a chance to interact with students? Yeah. Did he get a chance to interact with other faculty? Sure. I mean, if a student walked up and saw President Vines in his great big office, would that student be, I don't want to talk to that person. But what if you saw him in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt carrying a tennis bag? I mean, it made for, So I think President Vines learned a lot about the thoughts of students, the thoughts of faculty, just about the environment of the university there, simply by walking around. Management by wandering around. It's a great concept. I would certainly say it would be something you would want to embrace, if I can use a word that sounds that formal. Okay, let me go back kind of to the first page. He talks about some things. He talks about communication barriers. And he said, there are like physical barriers to communication, sometimes just walls or noise or stuff like that. He said there's also semantic barriers to communications. I think I mentioned to you, I do want you to be familiar with what formal communication channel is. I want you to be familiar with the informal communication channel, the grapevine, and management by wandering around. Okay, talking about communication barriers. He says there can be semantic barriers. I'd like for you to be familiar with semantics. What is that? That's the study of words, the fact that words differ. Let me find, I've got my book pretty close. There's a couple of things I want to pick up out of the book as it relates to kind of what we're talking about right now. Let me see if I can find it. Formal, informal communications. Again, don't forget that. Don't forget that measurement by wandering around. That's a great technique. Semantics is the study of the meaning of words. You know, some words have a number of different meanings. How about the word love? You can use that word a lot of different ways. How about the word cool? Now look, especially in my day, a little while ago, if somebody was cool, that didn't mean he needed to put on a jacket. He was cool. But then the temperature is cool. So when you are encoding your message, remember words have different meanings. So if you're using a word that has multiple meanings, make sure you encode in such a way that that person that's receiving it understands the word the way you're trying to convey it. Okay. Something else he talks about, and I put it on your handout, but I didn't give it to you. Some personal, what he calls personal or barriers to communications. All right. I'd like for you to be familiar with what semantics is. I'd like for you to also be familiar with these personal barriers to communications. All right, I didn't put them on your handout, so if you don't have a book, have your pencil ready, okay? I just want to go through them and chat about them for a second. Personal barriers to communications. Barrier number 1, variable skills in communicating effectively. I don't communicate very well, that person does. That can be a barrier. When I worked at ULM, the president would have meetings that, with us. And there was one person in the meeting, Dr. somebody other, cannot remember his name now. When he talked, about half the words he said must have been 4 syllables long, 12 letters long, and I didn't have a clue what he was saying. And neither did about half the other people either. But every once in a while, I would just say, what did you just say in English? So I got varying skills in communicating effectively. If you're the sender, you've got to understand the skills of the receiver. That's what's important. Number 2, variations in trustworthiness and credibility. Okay, let me get on this for a second. Credibility and trustworthiness can mess up communication. If a person's not credible or if they're not trustworthy, you don't want to communicate with them. You got your guard up. And I'll tell you something else. If you've got a problem in your company with credibility and trustworthiness, you got communication, you got more problems as well. So that's the second one. Oversized egos. Our egos, our pride, our self-esteem, even arrogance are a 5th barrier. Yeah, your ego, your pride, arrogance. I hope people aren't like that, but sometimes they are. And if that's the case, it makes it hard to communicate. It makes it hard to communicate with that person. Usually these oversized egos, they know everything already anyway. You don't understand. Number next, faulty listening skills. Part of communication is listening. Some people don't listen very well. You got to focus to listen, just like you focus to. Hang on. I got too still. My lights went out. All right, I'm back. Hang on. Faulty listening. Tendency to judge others' messages. Suppose another student in this class sees you reading this text and says, I like the book we're reading. You might say, I agree, or you might say, I disagree, it's boring. The point is that we all have a natural tendency to judge others' statements from our own point of view. In other words, when you talk tendency to judge others, don't be judgmental. What you're trying to do is communicate. That's pretty good. Inability to listen with understanding. it's kind of like what we went back to talking about. You got to listen, but you've got to listen with the idea of understanding. Because remember what communication is? It has to do with understanding. Stereotypes and prejudices. Sometimes we stereotype. Hey, those old people. Those old people. It's hard to communicate with those people. They don't know what's going on. They mumble. It's old people. All right. Or your prejudices. I don't care what they said. Huh? They're Methodist. Methodist, I don't hear anything about talking to a Methodist. Okay, you get the idea. I like Methodist. Okay, just was using that. And then the last one is nonverbal communications. Do your gestures and facial expressions contradict your words? Now, we're going to talk about nonverbal in just a minute. But when you say one thing with your words, but you say something different with your gestures or your expressions, it's a barrier. So, all right, let me sum these back up. These are just be familiar with things, okay? So don't be crazy. Personal barriers, variable skills in communicating effectively, variations in trustworthiness or credibility, oversized egos, faulty listening skills, tendency to judge others' messages, inability to listen with understanding, and stereotypes and prejudices, and nonverbal communications being different than your verbal, speaking a different message. Okay. All right. So I'd like for you to be familiar with those. I'd like for you to be familiar with what semantics are. I'd like you to be familiar with those barriers. Okay, let's get into something pretty well laid out in your handout. Nonverbal communication. Is nonverbal communication important? Yes. Now, what is nonverbal communication? I hope you're kind of conjuring that up in your mind. Consists of messages sent outside of the written or spoken word. You don't write it, you don't speak it, but you still convey it. You know what we're talking about, nonverbal type stuff. Eye contact. I'm just going to go through them. I'm looking at them. You can too. Eye contact. What does can eye contact mean a lot? Whether you have eye contact or don't have eye contact with somebody, if you're staring them down. So eye contact is a real nonverbal communication on how you use it. Facial expressions. Oh my gosh. Frowning. What does that mean? Rolling your eyes. All those things like that. You may be saying one thing. You may be saying, "Oh, I'm really glad to see you," but your nonverbal is saying, "Oh my gosh, I don't want to see that person." All right. Body movement and gestures. Well, we know some gestures that can be right out offensive, but there's other gestures that you can have. Now, you may be one of those people that just folds your arms naturally. But if I were to walk into somebody's office and the first thing they did were fold their arms or cross their legs, what do you think that means? That's a barrier. They don't want to see me. They may say, "Hey Joe, come on in." But this is telling me, I don't want to see that person. I'm trying to close out here. Touch. Nonverbal, of course, right now we're not doing much touching, but just how you touch, if you touch, that sort of thing. The setting and the timing. What's the setting? If the setting is across a great big table or something like that, that's a little different. That's that idea of management by wandering around. Is the idea that you take any of those kind of formal settings type barriers and remove them. And then time. He said something here. Let me see if I can find it, because I really like it. I put it at the bottom of your notes, but I didn't expand on it. Nonverbal communications, we said what that was, and I'd be familiar with that, and I'd be familiar with the different types of nonverbal communication. Eye contact, we talked about, facial expressions, body movement and gestures, touch. Norms for touching vary significantly around the world. Some touch, touch is important. Some people like to communicate within 6 inches or a foot of each other. North America, 3 to 4 feet away. Of course, in this day and time, 3 to 4 yards away probably. The setting. How do you feel when you visit someone who sits behind a big desk and is backlit by a window so her face is obscured? That shows a nonverbal that's not very good. Time. When your boss keeps you waiting 45 minutes for an appointment with him, how do you feel? Timing's important. It's if you don't show up for a meeting that you had with one of your employees until late, that's a nonverbal way of saying, I didn't care much about it. Now here at the bottom of this page, he says, here's some things, here's some do's and don'ts as it relates to nonverbal communication. Let's see what he says. Do maintain eye contact. Do lean towards the speaker. Now don't fall over, but that shows an interest. Speak at a moderate rate. Speak in quiet, reassuring tone, if the occasion calls for that. Smile and show animation. I am so glad that you are here. Nonverbal. Occasionally nod your head in agreement. That lets the person know that at least they think that you're listening. Be aware of your facial expressions. We've already talked about that. What are some things you don't want to do that are nonverbal in nature? Don't look away from the speaker. Hey, I'm talking to you. Turn away from the speaker. That's even worse. What if you're talking to somebody about something that's important to you and they walk off? Ooh. Speak too quickly or too slowly. If you speak too quickly, you can't get it all in. If a person speaks too slowly, you're finishing the sentence for them. Speak in an unpleasant tone. Be pleasant. Even if you have something that's not particularly good to talk about, be pleasant about it. Yawn excessively. I guess it's okay to yawn a little bit, but don't yawn too much. Close your eyes. Now, I think, sometimes in church, my wife is the pianist, so she doesn't sit with me a lot. She sits up on the stage. And sometimes she'll say, well, Joe, I think I caught you during the sermon closing your eyes. And I tell her, but I concentrate better when I close my eyes. Not sure she buys that. By the way, we have really good sermons. Lick your lips, bite your nails, or play with your hair. Okay. I'm not throwing those. I do want you to be familiar with the different types of nonverbal communications. I want you to be familiar with what nonverbal communication is. Now those do's and don'ts, those were free. Those are free. You do not have to be familiar with those at all. All right. A few more things in chapter 15. Let's see what else we've talked about communications and then knowing that. We've talked about the communication process and knowing it. Media richness, lean and rich, and being familiar with that like we are with semantics, with those personal barriers. We want to be familiar with what nonverbal communications is, if it's not written, not spoken. We want to know some of the different types of nonverbal communications. We'd also talked about the formal, informal communication channels and some things to be familiar with there. There was a few things kind of towards the end of the chapter. I've got them in my handout, so I'm just going to kind of mention some things that he said that might be a good idea to be familiar with. He says that with the technology we have today, we are doing more and more multi-communicating. The use of technology to participate in several interactions at the same time. Today is not maybe today, but generally speaking, we move at a very hurried pace. Managers are all over the world. Sometimes employees are scattered out all over the place. And you're trying to do several things and everything. The fact that technology today allows us to do multi-communicating is very, very helpful. I'd just be familiar. All this stuff you're more familiar with than I am. But multi-communication, the use of technology to participate in several interactions at the same time. And y'all do a lot more of that than I do, and probably do it well. He says, the digital age, what are some of the sides of the digital age? He says security issues. We know that. There's been some problems there, probably even still are. Privacy issues. Cell phone abuse, just some things. So look, do I want to go back from the digital. Let's don't have the digital age. Let's get rid of the internet. Let's get rid of all that stuff. No. But recognize that technology, as it advances, there are some downsides to it. Does that mean you don't do it? No. It just means, like, if you're talking about security, make sure you handle that correctly. Privacy, that sort of thing. The last thing he talked about in this chapter, I'd just be familiar with some of the downsides of the digital age. The last thing he talked about was being effective. He says being an effective listener, being an effective reader, being an effective writer, and a speaker. Okay. There was a few comments. Let me see if I can find that. There was a few comments about each one of those that he made that I might like for us to be familiar with. And so let me kind of flip back that way and see if I can find those things about being effective. Being an effective listener. He says, active listening, truly listening, involves more than hearing, which is merely the physical component. Active listening is the process of actively decoding and interpreting verbal messages. The only thing I'd like for you to be familiar with here is be an active listener. If you just listen and you're just kind of on cruise, you've got to actively listen. I think it's a pretty good idea. It'll help you a lot. Being an effective reader. Now, I wish we were in class so that we could talk about this, but one of the things our author mentions is this. Realize that speed reading doesn't work. Now, speed reading has never worked for me, or most anybody that I know of, but he says, perhaps you thought that somewhere along the line you could take a course on speed reading. By and large, however, speed reading isn't effective. So just be familiar with the fact that most of the time, for the way you're as a manager are going to need to understand and communicate, speed reading is probably not a good idea. To be an effective writer, write simply, concisely, and directly. Now, I'm sure you've had this in other courses, but I thought this was pretty good. If you want to be an effective writer, write simply, because you can communicate better that way. Write concisely. You want to give all the facts, you want to give all the details, you want to make sure it's complete, but make it concise. Make it concise. And be direct. Don't ramble around. Go to whatever it is that you're needing to write. Okay, and then I'd be familiar with the idea of writing simply, concisely, and directly. Then being an effective speaker. Tell them what you're going to say it, tell them what you said. So that's a pretty good key to being an effective speaker. Repetition helps. Now, it can get crazy sometimes. Repetition helps. Being an effective speaker, let people know what you're gonna be saying, what you're gonna be talking about. Like in this chapter, communications. Then say what it is that you need to say, and then tell them again what you said. I think those are kind of neat little things about that. I'd just be familiar with those things that make us an effective speaker. Say what we're going to say it, and tell them what we said. An effective writer, to write simply, concisely, and directly. And again, I'm kind of reading this to you, which is okay. If we were in class, we would discuss our way through this. So anyway, I think that is a lot of chapter 15. Chapter 15 has to do with communications. I can tell you 100%. If you are a poor communicator, you're going to be a poor manager. 100% of the time. Because you've got to be able to communicate to do most of the things that you do as a manager. And this manager stuff is hard work. We talked, I guess the last chapter we talked about leadership. Do you need to learn leadership? Sure. Do you need to continually work at improving your leadership abilities? Yes. Communications. Do you need to be an effective communicator? Yes. Do you need to continually improve your communication skills? Yes. Okay. That's chapter 15. The excitement mounts here because we've got one more chapter, chapter 16, that we've got to cover. And that's the one chapter on control. I think I told you at the beginning of the book, it seems like, the latter part of the book, after chapter 4, the whole rest of the book is on planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. And he spent a bunch of chapters on planning, a bunch of chapters on organizing, even more chapters on leading. And then I think he probably sent the book off to the publisher, and the publisher called him back up and said, what about control? Oh, yeah, I forgot that one. Send it back to me. So he did one chapter on control. But I will say this about that one chapter, chapter 16 on control. It's a really good chapter. It's a great chapter to kind of end up with. Okay, so this takes care of chapter 15. We've got our no's, we've got our be familiar with. We know how important communications is. I'm getting ready to give the loud noise so Professor Pierce knows that we have finished a chapter, and then I will see if I can change into something else for you, and we will do chapter 16. Done. Talk with you later.